Good afternoon. I'm Jim Caldwell, and I'm happy that you have joined me. In this pandemic, we are all getting used to Zoom. Here we are in my studio in Woodside, where I've been painting for 37 years. I've lived in Woodside for 60 years. This presentation is in conjunction with my show at the Art Ventures Gallery in Menlo Park. You will see that I've noted which paintings are in that show. So let me do a screen share and get started here. I am so pleased to talk to you about the beauty of trees. It has given me a reason to share this wonderful voyage of discovery, which has been my artistic career. In the next 40 minutes, I will take you on a ride from Paris to New Haven to Banff to Yosemite and points in between. With black and white photos, plein air watercolors, etchings, and paintings. You will see numerous recurring themes in my paintings. In 1964 was a significant turning point in my life. After graduating from Williams College, I decided to take a year off to see firsthand all the wonderful European treasures which I had studied as an art major. Since I had studied French, I decided that my base would be Paris, and I was able to enroll in the etching studio of the famous École des Beaux-Arts. By another stroke of good luck, I was able to get an artist loft in the top floor of the Fondation des États-Unis, the biggest dormitory at the huge student complex at the south edge of the city. You can see my loft in this photograph indicated by the blue arrow. It had a north-facing skylight and a view of the park across the street. I had a roommate, but there was plenty of room for my easel and my paints, and for this I paid $37 a month. This is an etching which I did in the École des Beaux-Arts. The forest, with its canopies reaching for the sky, was to become a recurrent theme in my work. My fascination with negative space, or the space left over around an object, in this case the spaces between the tree trunks, is also a recurring theme. That year, on the advice of a fellow student, I did many small plein air or outdoor watercolor sketches like this one, sometimes standing in the middle of the street, as I did to paint this kiosk. I love the contrast between the red of the kiosk and the rich green foliage of nature in the city. I also started painting in oils in the studio of an expat named Henri Gutz. I would paint in my own studio at the Fondation, and on Saturdays would go to the Gutz studio for a crit. I also filled up numerous drawing sketchbooks and spent lots of time copying from the masters in the Louvre. What a joy it was to be totally immersed in art. The next year, I was back in New Haven at the Yale School of Architecture. I threw away my paints as it was time to learn to be an architect. However, I took a wonderful photography course from the famous Walker Evans. Now I had a Pentax 35mm camera. This assignment was to make a photo essay of the street where I was living. In this photo, I was fascinated by the abstract patterns that the raindrops created in the water, the leaves half submerged in the gutter, the different textures of the pavement, and the contrast between light and dark. And in this one, I loved the contrast between nature and the texture of the leaves and the tree bark, with the texture of the brick, the woodwork, the Venetian blinds in the window, the picket fence in the back, and the shiny reflective glass in the door. Even though this is a black and white photo, we know that the house number 18 is in gold leaf. Nature is so good at softening the urban environment. I also took a wonderful color course from Cy Silman, the protege of Joseph Albers. We explored the relative nature of color and had to do leaf collages like this one. Here I am celebrating the negative space of the purple paper and the subtle differences in color between the two sides of the leaf. I love the fine sawtooth edges of the leaves and nature's imperfections. Back at home in Woodside one summer, I captured the beauty of the sun streaming through the giant eucalyptus trees on Highway 84 just before it heads up the mountain. The moment I came upon this, I had to stop in the middle of the road to capture it. I love the shadows on the road, the bark dripping from the branches on the right, and the drama of the dark and light. There's something so wonderful about black and white photographs. In 1969, I married Flip Redlick, and when we traveled, I continued my small plein air watercolor and pencil travel sketches, something I could finish in about 30 minutes. In this one, the palm tree is overhanging the group of colorful fishing boats. Excuse me. Here we are on the edge of the lush tropical jungle of Mexico with negative spaces between the palm trees. I love the texture of the fence on the right. When I was in the second grade, I had a classmate who lived in the forest and on a creek. The forest felt so sheltering to me, and I told myself that someday I too wanted to live in the forest. In 1974, I designed and built a house for my family in the redwood forest on Bear Gulch Creek in Woodside. The creek is in the foreground. We are still living in that house. This property has certainly contributed to my lifelong love of the forest. 39 years ago, I decided to get back to my oil painting and enrolled in the only night course I could find, which was at the local junior college. The teacher was Richard Heisig, and he really lit a fire in my belly. He taught acrylics, so I painted in acrylics. He introduced me to the palette of colors which I'm still using today. No neutrals except white and no black. Mixed blacks and neutrals are always richer. Soon, painting was a part of my daily routine. I started with still lifes in a spare bedroom. In this one, I was fascinated by the reflections of the eggshells interacting with the shadows. I was also studying the thinness and transparency of the eggshells, the translucency of the eggshells and the reflected light on the subtle colors of the brown eggs. In 1987, I built a painting studio which doubles as my office, next to my house under the redwoods. For 37 years, I've had the good fortune to be a self-employed architect, and I've painted for an hour after breakfast every day from 7 to 8, while most people are commuting to work. When I built my studio, it was as if I were preparing for the trip that my in-laws were to take us on in 1989 to the Canal du Midi in France. Suddenly, I was inspired to give up my small still lifes and to paint large landscapes. The grand, stunning, complex images I saw on the canal demanded large canvases. Does this look familiar? In this one, I loved the glassy reflections of the trees in the still waters offset with the splashes of sunlight coming from the left. The breeze ruffling the water in the center, the rhythm of the plane tree trunks as the canal wraps around the corner to the left, and the slashes of sky reflected in the water, separating the two tree canopies. This was the beginning of my fascination with the effects of light on water, another recurring theme in my paintings. This was a windy afternoon, and the water is now bright with the reflections of the sky. The shadows of the trees coming from the right are cutting off the reflections of the trunks. I love the stripes of sunlight like railroad ties on the towpath and the multitude of greens. We can glimpse the brilliant chartreuse of the ripe grapevines beyond the trees to the left. At that time, I switched from acrylics to oils, which are far richer, do not change color when they dry, and do not shrink so that the brush marks are more visible. In 1991, we took a trip to the Southwest, and suddenly the sky, which is so dominant there, became another important element in my paintings. Until then, I had been intimidated by clouds. We were staying in Santa Fe, and we had planned to visit Georgia O'Keeffe's house at Ghost Ranch. The weather was very stormy, and I suggested that we call it off. My wife insisted that we go, and of course, I was ultimately glad that we did. I love this image for the richness and variety of the colors of the earth, the texture and pattern of the greasewood, and the sweep of the road, and the wonderful complexity of the stormy sky. This was the view of a little further down the road when the The sun momentarily came bursting through the inky dark clouds to illuminate the colorful canyon walls. Georgia O'Keeffe said it well. I've made you take the time to look at what I saw, unquote. With my camera, I've been able to capture the light and the clouds and the shadows just the way I saw them in the moment. For me, if Zion had waterfalls, it would be more beautiful than the iconic Yosemite Valley. Instead of gray granite, the walls of this spectacular box canyon are multi-hued, and at the head of the canyon is a narrow river gorge more beautiful than anything I've ever seen. Every twist and turn is more dramatic than the last, with deep shadows, warm reflected light, and the spectacular stone walls raked by the midday sun. Notice the diminutive tree and the figures which give a wonderful sense of scale. In the early 90s, we took several trips to Palm Desert, and I was immediately inspired by the rhythm of the trunks of the date palm forest, planted with the care and regularity of an orchard. Getting closer, we can see the negative spaces of the desert sky beyond peeking through. In this one, there's a strong sense of perspective and depth on the left as we look down the rows. Finally, I love the sense of depth and space within the cathedral-like forest. Now the negative space is the sky peeking through the palm fronds overhead. It challenged my patience to paint the complications of the canopy of the palm fronds. On a recent trip to the desert, it was unusually stormy, and I captured this dramatic image of the shadows racing across the jagged mountains. The cold, dark clouds are in contrast with the warm, sunny foreground. There was snow on the distant peaks. I loved the palm trees silhouetted in the middle in contrast with the natural desert shrubs. No black pigment was used in the clouds. My favorite artist is John Singer Sargent, who was a master at combining loose, big, bold brushstrokes for a satin dress with just the right amount of fine small brush detail in the face. I've tried to do that in my landscapes as well, so that my paintings are interesting from a distance as well as up close. This detail shows that I've used my smallest brush to add the trunks of the palm trees. In 1990, a friend invited us up to a beautiful ranch in Geyserville, and I was inspired to paint a series, including this one of a creek. Here it is about the late afternoon sun on the hill beyond, reflecting light off the still waters and the tree trunks in silhouette. I love the full range of colors. At the same time, our daughter introduced us to the Stanford foothills, where she had been walking, affectionately known as the Dish, for its large radio telescope. There is an elaborate network of footpaths maintained by Stanford and beloved by the community. I had been driving by these hills on Highway 280 for so many years, but it was as if I were discovering the beauty of these foothills and oaks for the first time. One afternoon, we had planned to walk at the Dish, but it was threatening rain. My wife insisted that we go, like that afternoon in the Southwest, and thank goodness we did. In the space of an hour, I had photographed enough images for many dramatic paintings. Here we have the sun breaking through the dark storm clouds in the middle distance with dramatic shadows in the foreground. This was the beginning of my love affair with oaks on rolling golden hills, as well as the panoramic format, which has become my favorite shape. With our binocular vision, that is the way we see. Movie screens are that format for the same reason. Backlighting is always dramatic, with the tree trunks once again creating interesting negative spaces. I love the long early morning shadows and the sun glinting off the bay in the background. I love the deep green of the tree canopies and the golden grasses. This one places the Stanford campus with its iconic tower in context. It is a wonderful combination of the 200-year oak tree, the campus buildings nestled into the landscape, and the glory of San Francisco Bay in the distance. I love the richness of the dark green foliage. We are blessed to have so much undeveloped land this close to the urban corridor of the peninsula. Thank you, Leland Stanford. Here we have a much closer look at an extraordinary at the extraordinarily twisted trunk of a huge valley oak, leaning over at an impossible angle, counterbalanced with its canopy of foliage. What makes the trunk so twisted? It turns out that oak branches rarely bud out at the end of the branch, often budding in a twisting pattern. Growing up in Woodside, I was delighted to be able to climb these trees so easily. The stiff-ribbed bark provides perfect handholds. It was as if the trees were bending over to receive me. A unique peninsula phenomenon is the fog boiling over the Coast Range. In the summertime, the heat of the Sacramento Valley draws in the coastal fog. In this painting, the Coast Range is completely obscured. There are two kinds of oaks standing side by side, silhouetted against the fog, glowing with the reflected light. One is the dense evergreen coast live oaks on the left. The other is the more open, deciduous valley oak next to it. This is the property deep in the redwoods next to our house. I love that the bay trees are bending over to grab some of the sunlight from the redwoods. Also, I love the many sunny green negative spaces of foliage. Here, as in the date palm forest, I'm celebrating the complexity of the branches. A friend of ours has a large ranch in the foothills to the east of San Jose. I've been inspired to paint the oaks and the foothills on this ranch numerous times. Here are the lavender shadows of early morning. It's an interesting mix of evergreen coast live oaks, which have prickly leaves and dense canopies and tend to grow in clusters, and valley oaks, which lose their leaves in the winter. The majestic valley oaks have a traditional oak leaf, more open canopies, and tend to stand by themselves in the landscape, like the one in the center and the right. My favorite time of year is early in the summer when the grass seeds are still in their seed pods, giving the golden grass fields a particular velvety softness. We don't think of California landscapes as green, and yet for at least 4 months a year, we have lush emerald grasses on their hillsides, and the winter clouds are so dramatic. When I saw this extraordinarily beautiful combination of colors and shapes, textures and light, it was long before the smartphone, and I did not have my camera with me. It had touched my heart, so I drove home to get my camera, hoping that the scene would not have changed much by the time I had returned. When I got back, the sun was hiding, but I waited, and my patience was soon rewarded. The deciduous valley oak in the center has already begun to leaf out. Here we see 3 overlapping valley oaks in the wintertime. They have lost their leaves to show off their extraordinary branch structure. Dense green bunches of mistletoe become visible in the canopy. It is a particular challenge to paint the branches of a deciduous tree without getting too fussy. The colors are very subtle. I have stopped illegally along a freeway many times to take a photograph of a scene which inspires me, capturing a moment in time. I'm flattered when a collector says she saw one of my landscapes while driving down 280. There is a particularly beautiful series of hills and specimen valley oaks just south of Petaluma, which you may have noticed on the east side of 101. I have painted this area dozens of times. I love this little knoll swelling out of the valley floor where often there are cows grazing. The windmill is a nice detail. I painted this in the fall when some of the buckeyes had started to turn colors. I love all the textures of the foliage and the complex shadows. These are the magnificent oaks on the west side of 101, south of Gilroy. I love the contrast between the natural landscape and the perspective of the carefully tilled fields ready for planting. Another wonderful discovery was the Sawyer Camp Trail along the Crystal Springs reservoirs. Every time we walk there, I come back with an image I want to paint. In this one, I have tried to capture the late, low afternoon sun as it splashes on the edge of the distant shoreline, the wisp of fog as it starts to pour over the Highway 92 gap, the wind-ruffled water, and the beautiful protected forest of the watershed. In contrast, this painting shows the glassy stillness of the water in the early morning just before sunrise, with the two walkers on the path. A slight breeze has ruffled the water in the middle distance of the reservoir. Here, the palette of colors is much cooler. The Coast Range ridgeline is mirrored in the lake. Now it is the low light of early morning on Tamales Bay. Not a breath of wind. The mirror-like surface of the water reflects the brilliant blue sky and the lacy stand of eucalyptus. The man walking his dog along the bay in the center of the image gives the scene a depth and scale. This is a very different light. Now the afternoon fog has begun to roll in with the sun breaking through the far bank of the bay. I love the soft light on the hills and the silhouettes of the eucalyptus. There was a lone shorebird in the center of the image, so I included him. The dark shadows in the foreground add a sense of drama to this pastel palette. In 2010, I was supervising the construction of a house I had designed in Carmel. In an early one clear winter morning after a storm, my wife and I drove out to Point Lobos. The only time I had been there before had been in the dense fog, and I had not understood the appeal of this magic place in the right weather conditions. We were in for a treat. In this one, I loved the smooth green hill in the back in contrast with the texture of the rocky shore, the cypress trees silhouetted against the mist, and the blue waters churned by the winter storm. The orange ice plant on the caps of the rocks on the left is quite wonderful. In 3 hours of hiking, I had captured enough wonderful images for many paintings. I'm still painting from those inspiring images I took that morning. In this one, I liked the rugged rocks set against the calm Carmel coastline and the drama of the white water in contrast with the dark shadows in the cypress and the cypress silhouettes. We've been back several times since then. Here I was fascinated by the complication of cypress tree branches in the dense forest. Lots of interesting negative spaces with the blue Carmel coastline peeking through. On a similar theme, I was captivated by the forest near Land's End in San Francisco. I loved the dappled light as it filtered down through the canopy onto the warm forest floor, and the rich texture of the tree trunks as they fade into the distance. And this one with the sunlight slanting through the winter mist of the Presidio forest, the splash of sun falling on the green forest carpet, the trees disappearing in the mist. More interesting negative spaces. Each kind of tree has its own very different character. 10 years ago, we stopped in Africa on the way to the Seychelles Islands. In my opinion, you do not need to go halfway around the world to see beautiful islands, beautiful fish, and warm tropical water. But I discovered that there is no substitute for Africa. I thought I would be inspired by the grassland landscape seen in North Africa, but we are in South Africa where there are no savannas. It was the end of the dry season, and I grew to love the subtle colors of the dry forest. It was all about the intimate spiritual relationship with those beautiful fellow mammals. When I returned home, I painted the animals for several months. Here were the endlessly fascinating spots of the beautiful cheetah, backlighted against the late afternoon sun. The golden coat of the cat blended so beautifully with the neutral tones of the dry forest. A short time later, we drove up to this herd of zebras. I loved the complex, unique patterns of the zebra stripes and the sharp edges playing off the soft neutrals of the forest beyond them. The two zebra heads bracketed the composition. The black in this painting is a mix of dark blue, dark red, and dark green. We've been to Europe many times over the years. I painted this one 27 years ago on my 50th birthday. It was so quintessentially Irish, with its conical stone tower and its pattern of emerald fields separated by hedges. The country lane cut through the tall grasses leads us deep into the landscape. For many years, I had dreamed of painting Tahiti, as Gauguin did. And when we finally went a year ago, I wondered why we hadn't discovered it sooner. There is so much unspoiled beauty. These volcanic islands are so different than Hawaii. This extreme panorama seemed particularly appropriate for capturing the island of Bora Bora and the fascinating phenomenon of the motu, where small volunteer islands would spring up around the atolls. Birds drop seeds on a piece of coral atoll, which is above the tide line, and pretty soon a tiny piece of vegetation has sprung up. Of course, I had been to Yosemite before, but 10 years ago, I rediscovered its splendor. I have been back several times since to see this magic place in different seasons. This is the famous tunnel view on the road to Wawona. It captures three of the great monuments of the valley: El Capitan, Bridal Veil Falls, and Half Dome in the distance, all springing out of the dense forest of the valley floor. There are always lots of photographers there waiting for that moment when the light is perfect. This is the cool early morning light when Bridal Veil Falls is in shadow. And this is the late afternoon sun with a golden light bathing the valley and a much more interesting sky. The volume of water in Bridal Veil Falls tells us that it is spring. Each time I have been at Tunnel View Overlook, the light has been different and I've wanted to paint it again. I can understand why Thomas Hill painted the same monumental valley Yosemite scenes over and over again. There is something magic about the spatial quality of the valley. Here the clouds are hanging over the upper cliffs of El Capitan, and the Merced River is capturing the multitudes of green in its glassy surface. The tall, dark spruce trees are silhouetted against the gray granite. Last January, after a snowstorm in the Sierras, it occurred to me that I had never seen Yosemite in the wintertime. What a thrill it was. It had snowed 2 days before, and even the smallest branches were piled with snow. This is one of my favorite views, with the El Capitan catching the morning sun on the left and Bridal Veil Falls in shadow on the right, a mist hanging over the meadows, every rock in the river capped with snow. The vapor trails in the sky lead us down the valley. Of course, this is similar to Tunnel View, but with the added interest of the Merced River in the foreground. I've painted the snow country many times, with numerous scenes of Sun Valley. Here I loved the contrast between the dark evergreen conifers of the mountains and the bare aspen trees catching the early morning sun, and the feathery red willows. The fence, with its posts receding in the distance, gives a sense of space. One of the joys of a smartphone is that I can have it in my pocket when I'm skiing. It allows me to capture a scene like this one. Wow. The beauty of this scene took my breath away. The cloud layer was below us. The trees were groaning under the weight of the new snow, and there were fresh tracks down through the powder at the top of the Martis Camp chairlift. The early morning light was dazzling on the snow-laden branches. In 2004, we took the wonderful train trip across the Canadian Rockies. I saw this view out of the window of our bus on our bus ride to the station, and I insisted the driver stop so I could capture this image. I was fascinated by the complexity of the different layers of clouds, partially shrouding the rugged, treeless mountains with the deep green of the dense evergreen forest in the foreground. At the end of that trip, we spent a few days on the west coast of Vancouver Island with its super wide, endless beaches. I loved the magnificent clouds and their complex reflections in the wet sand. The tiny figures give a sense of the vastness of the landscape. The small, dark, backlit island punctuated the composition, with the old growth cedars fading into the distance. Several years ago, an old Stockton friend, Judy Hackman, took me out on her boat on the San Joaquin Delta. It was beautiful, with the trees sprouting from the islands in the river. That is the east side of Mount Diablo in the distance. but I suspected that if I could get a few hundred feet in the air, it would be a very different visual experience. Of course, I was familiar with Wayne Thiebaud's Delta series. So I rented a helicopter, and with Judy's guidance, I discovered that the views were absolutely stunning. I fell in love with the pattern of the waterways meandering through the delta and the interesting patterns of shadows on the fields, the rich palette of colors, and the ribs of the cultivated earth. In this painting, it was about the geometric patterns of the agricultural fields, the rich chocolate earth, the reflections in the cool blue water interplaying with the early morning shadows, and the swollen shape of the river as it pushes up against the edges of the levee. Thiebaud distorted the perspectives of the delta with a wonderful sense of humor. I have painted it as is. In 2009, after hearing about Stanford Camp and this wonderful lake most of my life, we finally discovered the beauty of Fallen Leaf Lake. I was captivated by its intimacy. I loved the reflections of the sun-drenched mountain in the still morning waters. Two fishermen are hiding in the shadows. After Fallen Leaf, Lake Tahoe seems like an ocean. I have painted Pepperwood, a beautiful nature preserve north of Santa Rosa, numerous times. I'd never heard of it until about a year ago when a friend of mine suggested I visit it. The oaks are magnificent. The rolling hills sensual and the black cows are a wonderful accent on the landscape. We were allowed to spend the night on the property, so I was able to capture the late afternoon and evening light as well as the early morning light, my two favorite times of day, when the shadows are long and the light is dramatic. I captured many beautiful images. I was scheduled for a show there until the virus struck. It will happen next year. In this one, I love the cluster of the Black Angus, the long late afternoon shadows, and the oaks silhouetted against the sky. Here we see a huge oak bending over the road as it curves around the steep hill, the oak-covered ridgelines receding into the distance, the rhythm of the fence posts, the deep shadows of early morning. This large painting combines many of the elements which make Pepperwood so beautiful. Receding ridgelines, huge oaks, a great variety of wild grasses, Black Angus cows, and long morning shadows. We are so lucky that landscapes like these have been preserved by the generosity of the California benefactors for our future generations to appreciate and enjoy. A place where scientists, as well as our children, can study nature up close. This is a very recent painting of coast live oaks. I'm fascinated by the very complicated tangle of branches and their extraordinary horizontal reach. What I'm painting is the negative spaces of the sky and the green foliage. I love the contrast between the randomness of nature and the regularity of the boxwood in the foreground. I will quickly run through the paintings in the show which I have not yet shown you. Two water tanks in the late afternoon in Pepperwood. I love all the textures of green and dry grasses and the rich palette of warm and cool colors of the Elkhorn Slough. I love the laciness of the eucalyptus trees and the bold stripe of yellow and the hills fading off into the distance. In this one, I love the huge spruces silhouetted against the granite cliffs of Yosemite and the diminutive figure in the snow silhouetted against the mist. This is in the deep forests of Big Sur with a splash of sunlight on the hillside trail. I love the evergreen trees set off against the bright white of the snow. This was more snow than Sun Valley had seen in many years. I love the winter clouds and the brilliance of the green hillside with the soft canopies of the valley oaks silhouetted against the brilliant sky. I love the silhouettes of trees and the cool shadows and the exaggerated proportions of the ridgeline at the Pepperwood Preserve. I love the shapes of the coast live oaks as they cluster in the draws. I love the drama of the valley oaks in shadow against the bright golden grass. In this one, I love the massive oak with Spanish mosses dripping from its branches. In this one, I love the trees and the cows in silhouette at Pepperwood. This massive stand of eucalyptus just off of 101 at the Marinwood exit is particularly magnificent. I will end with this extraordinary tree near our house in Woodside. It's an unusual deciduous European white oak, not native, which is more than 250 years old. Could a sapling have been planted by a missionary? Again, I am fascinated by the negative spaces seen through the foliage, as well as the sheer magnificence of its mighty branches reaching for the sky. Again, we have the irregularity of nature set off against the rhythm of the vineyard beyond. I hope you will have a chance before September 15th to drop by Art Ventures Gallery in Menlo Park to see the show celebrating my trees. If you can't make it to the gallery but would like to see the show virtually, you can request an illustrated price list from the gallery owner, Kate Powers. I'm grateful to Kate for putting on this show for me. You can see all of my inventory on my website, jimcaldwellart.com. I'm so happy to have shared with you some of my favorite paintings. I hope you have enjoyed this trip through my career, which has been so closely linked to my passion for the beauty of trees.